Greetings, everyone. Hello to all. We're just having some technical difficulties, so I apologize in advance. We're just joined by Sanjoy Hazarika, who is the International Director of CHRI, and he will join us by audio. And I just would like to check that everyone can hear him. Go ahead, Sanjoy.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. And I hope you can hear me wherever you are in the world. I'm Sanjoy Hazarika, the International Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, or CHRI, which works on issues of human rights, as its name suggests, across the Commonwealth, with offices in New Delhi, London, and Accra. More on CHRI later, but first a very warm welcome to our panelists, participants, and moderator for the day for this side event, Contemporary Forms of Slavery and COVID-19, Mitigating Risks, Addressing Challenges, and Identifying Good Practices. This side event is held in parallel to the UN Human Rights Council 45th regular session, and is co-organized by CHRI and the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Contemporary Forms of Slavery and the Commonwealth 8.7 network. I especially wish to welcome Mr. Tomoya Obokata, the UN Special Rapporteur on Special Contemporary Forms of Slavery, or CFS. He's just 6 months old into that job, but has already presented his first report to the current HRC session on the impact of COVID-19 on CFS. Sneha Arora is our moderator for the panel. She is director of CHRI's London office and oversees CHRI's program on contemporary forms of slavery, as well as engagement and advocacy with UN human rights mechanisms. As we all know, this unprecedented crisis caused by COVID-19 has impacted all segments of the world. The economic and social consequences of this outbreak have been particularly harsh on those who are already in vulnerable situations. This includes people trapped in slavery-like conditions, as well as those subjected to different human rights violations, discrimination, marginalization, social and economic inequalities, and limited or no social and labor protection. COVID has also had a disproportionate impact on informal workers, on women, children, and young people, minority groups, indigenous people, and people affected by caste-based discrimination, as well as refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons. Migrant workers are also badly affected. This is a calamitous time, and today's discussion is joined by representatives from states, international organizations, civil society, and academia to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on contemporary forms of slavery and efforts to eradicate it. We face a situation where an estimated 40.3 million people are trapped in situations of contemporary forms of slavery before the COVID-19 outbreak, and almost 40% of that figure are located in Commonwealth countries. A bit about CHRI. We are an independent, non-government, non-profit organization that works for the practical realization of human rights across the Commonwealth. Founded in '87, it works for its goals through research, strategic advocacy, litigation at times, partnerships, capacity building, engagement, and mobilization. CHRI founded and is secretariat to the Commonwealth 8.7 network, the co-organizer, an international network of over 60 local civil society organizations with a common vision to end contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking. Very eloquently, a few days ago, the Special Rapporteur, with a marshalling of powerful facts, presented a strong report to the HRC's current session, focusing on COVID-19's impact on contemporary forms of slavery. Last month, CHRI and Walk jointly released a report, Eradicating Modern Slavery, an assessment of Commonwealth government's progress on achieving SDG Target 8.7. The objectives of this side event are simple. They are perhaps threefold. One, to raise awareness of how COVID-19 has and will continue to impact contemporary forms of slavery and present challenges for states and civil society. To explore how states and civil society have adapted to address these challenges in their efforts to tackle this issue, and to identify the needs of states and civil society to mitigate effects of the pandemic. I'd now like to hand over the proceedings to my colleague Sneha Arora, Director of CHRI's London office, who will now moderate the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjoy, and welcome to all. Just a few small reminders before we start, some housekeeping rules. Attendees who are joining us today will enter with their microphones and videos off, but do feel free to use the chat room for discussion between the delegates. You will also see in the chat room the full bios of all our speakers, as well as some relevant links to resources and some further information about the substantive content of our side event today. You can enter questions if you have them throughout the session in the chat box or in the QA box, and you can see that there's a Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can find that tab there. All your questions will be uploaded to the Q&A box, and you can also upvote the questions. So if there's any questions in there that you feel very strongly about, you can give it a thumbs up so that they will be prioritized for response by our panelists. In addition, just to let you know, we will be recording this event so that it will be available to view later on. We will also be live streaming the event on YouTube, and any questions from the viewers on YouTube will also be fed into the Q&A box. As we will be live tweeting throughout the event, we also encourage you to tweet if you are a tweeter. During or about this event, we have handles and hashtags that you can see in the chat box as well that you could use for that purpose. So, so that's a bit of housekeeping initially. Turning now to our first session. Our first session focuses on contemporary forms of slavery, progress in achieving SDG Target 8.7 in the Commonwealth. In July this year, and before I continue, I'd like to ask if we could share the PowerPoint presentation. In July this year, CHRI and Walk published a joint report, which was entitled Eradicating Modern Slavery, which is an assessment of Commonwealth government's progress on achieving SDG Target 8.7. CHRI and Walk wanted to engage governments, international and non-governmental organizations, and engage with civil society to take action on the issue of contemporary forms of slavery and all its manifestations. Whether we are talking about forced labor, debt bondage, trafficking in persons, forced marriage, domestic servitude, the worst forms of child labor, or other forms of exploitation and slavery-like practices. Next slide, please. And we know the Commonwealth should be taking strong action to tackle this issue. Based on the 2018 Global Slavery Index, we estimate that some 1 in 150 people living in the Commonwealth are living in contemporary forms of slavery. Our Eradicating Modern Slavery report raises concerns about the worsening condition of the people who are already in situations of or at risk of contemporary forms of slavery before the COVID-19 outbreak. The report highlights the need for a renewed urgency to deliver on the promises made by Commonwealth member states at the 2018 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. The report shows that progress to achieve SDG Target 8.7 is far too slow, and that all Commonwealth governments must do much more to eradicate modern slavery. In our report, we outline clear recommendations, and we call for urgent, coordinated action by all Commonwealth member states to assess, to respond, and to review their commitments to achieve SDG Target 8.7 by 2030. So joining me here to present some of the findings from the report is Catherine Bryant, our partner from Walk Free. Catherine is the lead of European engagement at Walk Free and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. She has over 10 years of experience working in counter-trafficking and anti-slavery programming and research. And you can also find her biography in the chat box. So Catherine, I believe that our report is the most comprehensive to date in terms of assessing Commonwealth government responses towards the achievement of SDG Target 8.7. Catherine, would you be able to walk us through the methodology and the data that sits behind this report?
Of course, and thank you, Sneh, and I'm really pleased to be joining this side event today to talk about modern slavery across the Commonwealth. And you're correct, it is the most comprehensive data set to date assessing government responses towards the achievement of SDG 8.7. I'll give you just a very brief overview of the methodology that sits behind the report. It is based on a conceptual framework that was first developed in 2014 for the Global Slavery Index to assess what governments are doing to respond to modern slavery. And this conceptual framework consists of 5 milestones, which you'll see on the screen in front of you. I'll give you just a little bit of background on a couple of those to go into the detail of what we capture within this conceptual framework. So you'll see the 5 milestones are support survivors, strengthen criminal justice, improve coordination and accountability, address risk factors, and eradicate exploitation from supply chains. Just to take the support survivors milestone, this includes indicators such as, does the government have a national hotline? Are there services that provide support to survivors, such as shelters, or long-term support, such as visas? With the criminal justice milestone, this includes the ratification of international conventions, as well as looking at whether this has been translated into domestic legislation and access to justice mechanisms. And then for the address risk factors, as another example, this includes action that the government is taking to try and prevent slavery from occurring within its jurisdictions. So it can include things such as labour rights for all vulnerable workers, making sure there's access to education, as well as access to health as well. And so those are the 5 milestones. If we can just click onto the next slide. Thank you. So sitting behind those milestones are actually 116 indicators, which test whether or not a government is taking action on this particular issue. These indicators, putting it another way, if you think about the 54 Commonwealth countries, actually represent over 6,000 data points. So that's where that comprehensive statement comes in. And this is fed into by several NGOs. We're about 41 NGOs covering about, 60 NGOs covering about 40 countries. And it also includes Survivor Voice covering 5 countries from across the Commonwealth. So although this is a joint report between Walk Free and CHRI, it is very much a collaborative effort. And I also want to mention the work of the Commonwealth 8.7 network there, feeding into this report.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I can agree with you. It truly was a mammoth effort, this report. And now maybe you could turn to the findings, a bit of insight into the findings. As I mentioned in my introduction, the findings were quite shocking, that progress in Commonwealth countries towards SDG Target 8.7 is too slow, and that based on current progress, we won't be able to achieve this SDG target, the Sustainable Development Goal target, by the year 2030. So could you give us more details, perhaps, on the findings of the report?
Of course, and yeah, there's an awful lot of data. Those 6,000 data points give us a lot of information. So I'll just go very top level. As you said, the overarching finding is that progress is too slow towards the achievement of SDG Target 8.7 by 2030. And we see this across the Commonwealth, on all 54 countries, but also more broadly, globally, I would say that statement would still hold true. If we can just click onto the next slide. So some of the data, some of the findings, I'll organise this by milestone, the milestones I introduced at the beginning. If we look at the support survivors dimension, we know that most countries have some form of victim support services available, often for victims of trafficking. However, we only see a quarter of countries across the Commonwealth have national referral mechanisms to coordinate this victim assistance. We also found that 65% of countries, despite these mechanisms being in place, reported gaps in funding for victim assistance programming. I would say that actually that probably is quite generous, and I'm sure if we asked most civil society organisations within those Commonwealth countries, they would say that was a lot higher. And that theme of things existing on paper or in policy or in legislation, but gaps in implementation kind of runs through all of the dimensions. For criminal justice, for example, we know that 45 of the 54 countries have criminalised human trafficking, 35 have criminalised forced labour, but every single country reports gaps in implementation. And under the criminal justice dimension, we see this even more so because obviously if we're talking about the 40.3 million people in modern slavery across the world, 15.7 million of those being in Commonwealth countries, we know the rate of prosecution is far, far too low if we're actually going to be tackling this issue. Around coordination, we saw that 21 of the 54 countries have bilateral labour agreements that provide protection for labour migrants. Again, I would say this is on paper. We've heard from our partners in Kenya, for example, that this is not always the practice in reality. But we see that a similar number, 21 countries, also report evidence that foreign victims are being detained or deported for immigration violations, so they're not accessing that protection. We skip on to the next slide. And then when looking at addressing risk factors, just looking at one risk factor, we see that 52 out of 54 countries have the right to freedom of association enshrined in law, but there's still gaps for certain more vulnerable groups such as domestic workers or migrant workers. And then finally, looking at supply chains, both in terms of public procurement and also businesses holding governments holding businesses to account. Very little action is taking place across the Commonwealth, with only 4 countries having policies in place. These are Australia, Cyprus, Malta, and the UK. And notably, no country has yet enacted legislation which requires mandatory human rights due diligence, which we're seeing being developed across the EU. So from this report, what we're calling for, to rectify these gaps that I've identified, the report also contains some very specific recommendations. I won't go into those now, but we will be talking about those in later sessions. From this report, CHRI and Walk are calling for modern slavery to be firmly set on the agenda for the next Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which will hopefully take place in June next year. We're also hoping that that commitment that was made in 2018 will be actually translated into concrete action with the launch of a major initiative. The final point I want to make before I wrap up is that this data were obviously collected in 2019 and in early 2020, pre-COVID. And we know that COVID has exacerbated the situation. Earlier this year, Walk Free released a rapid assessment called Protecting People in the Pandemic, which highlighted the impact of COVID-19 just on migrant workers. We suspect that progress towards 8.7 is going to be even slower given the impact of COVID-19, unless increased and sustained action is focused on this issue. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Catherine, for this. As you said, the CHRI and Walk Free report, Eradicating Modern Slavery, found that there were significant gaps in the response to eradicating contemporary forms of slavery. And with the COVID-19 outbreak, the situation has become even more bleak for those who are victims of or are vulnerable to contemporary forms of slavery. So last week during the Human Rights Council's 45th regular session, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery presented his report exactly on this issue. It was entitled The Impact of the Coronavirus Disease Pandemic on Contemporary Forms of Slavery and Slavery-like Practices. So joining me now is the Special Rapporteur, Tomoya Obokata, who was appointed in this position earlier this year. Mr. Obokata is a Japanese scholar of international law and human rights. He currently serves as Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Keele University. Mr. Obokata, you took up your term as Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery on the 1st of May, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and decided immediately to focus your first thematic report to the Human Rights Council on this issue. I understand that numerous civil society organizations, including CHRI, and also a few states and other actors provided input to this report. And I would like to ask you, what struck you the most when assessing the impact of COVID-19 on modern day slavery?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative and the Commonwealth 8.7 Network for co-organizing this event with us, and also other panelists and participants for their time. Indeed, I presented my report on the impacts of COVID-19 on contemporary forms of slavery to the Human Rights Council last week, which identifies key impacts and trends, good practices, and relevant human rights obligations. I was taken aback to realize how complex and multifaceted the impact of pandemic is beyond health and sanitary concerns. Globally, for example, the poorest and the most disadvantaged people cannot afford to protect themselves and their health as they are forced to work in order to survive. Some not only took health risks in this regard, but also suffered from repressive responses by the government in some countries. So once again, this pandemic has shown that not everyone has choices, and even less in such unique circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I would agree with you. The pandemic is a great challenge, especially for those that are already most vulnerable. Can you tell us what are some of the key findings relating to the immediate, the medium term, and to the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on contemporary forms of slavery? Could you please speak briefly to these?
Sure. The direct and indirect impacts of COVID-19 are very serious in many ways. What has happened in the past months as a result of the pandemic has shown, once again, the close interlinkages between poverty, marginalization, and slavery. For example, 60 million people are likely to be pushed into extreme poverty in 2020. And these same people could end up in exploitation, slavery, or servitude, as they may not have another choice than accepting work which violates their dignity and basic rights. Similarly, it is estimated that up to 66 million children could fall into extreme poverty. Temporary closure of schools combined with pressure from the sudden loss of livelihoods, food shortages, and breakdown of community safety nets may result in a permanent end to education for many children and a rise in child labor, including the worst forms of child labor. In some African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian countries, furthermore, a spike in sexual violence against children, including a significant increase in the number of girls married off before the age of 18, has been reported, leading to unplanned teenage pregnancies. This is also interlinked to growing economic hardships and disrupted education caused by the pandemic, resulting in an estimated 30 million more child marriages over the next 10 years, and further exacerbating the existing level of gender discrimination and inequality. At the same time, some states are shifting the resources from anti-slavery efforts to fight the pandemic. This is an understandable immediate reaction, but the negative consequences of this has been that the law enforcement responses to slavery, forced labor, and other slave-like practices are slowing down in some parts of the world. And this is making it even more difficult to investigate, prosecute, and punish perpetrators who are responsible for these practices. Furthermore, civil society organizations and public bodies which have traditionally provided much needed protection and assistance to survivors are not getting sufficient support as they compete with more limited resources while the demand have increased as a result of COVID-19. And certainly these and other development risks that risk delaying the achievement of SDG Target 8.7 even further, which would have an enormous cost, not only on survivors of slavery and slave-like practices, but also for other states.
Mm-hmm. Professor, you mentioned that governments are reallocating resources from anti-slavery efforts in order to deal with the pandemic in their countries. Is this lack of resources for anti-slavery efforts and survivor assistance also noticeable at the international level?
Yes, it is. And I would divert to Secretary of the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, Ms. Claudia Garres, who is also online and will be able to elaborate on this a little later. What I can say is that as a consequence of limited attention and support to survivors of forced marriage, debt bondage, forced and child labor, and other forms of exploitation and slavery, victims remain hidden and continue to be exploited in many parts of the world.
Yeah, lack of resources is indeed a challenge. And of course, we'll hear more from Ms. Jerez on the situation of the UN Voluntary Trust Fund you mentioned. Can you share with us any additional observations that you've made in your report regarding the impact of COVID-19 on the global slavery landscape, please?
Certainly. One of the things I have noticed or I received evidence is the suspension of labor and social protection laws and regulations in various countries. For example, in India, that is of a great concern to my mandate. This particularly, for example, affects those working in sectors which have seen a surge in demand for labor, like businesses providing essential items such as food, medicine, and medical equipment or PPE. Employers, including private companies, must do more to uphold labor rights, which are needed now more than ever to prevent millions of people from being pushed into exploitation and precariousness. For medium to long-term impacts of COVID-19, unemployment is the most serious issue for my mandate. This is emerging, there is emerging evidence that the current situation is forcing unemployed workers to find jobs in informal or even illegal economies. Legal and social protection are lacking or limited in the informal sector, and the illegal economy is heavily controlled by entities such as organized criminal groups, making workers vulnerable to exploitation and abuse.
Thanks, Professor. On that issue, we found when compiling the CHRI Walk Free report that there was a disproportionate impact on certain groups who were more vulnerable to contemporary forms of slavery. It has also been reported that COVID-19 does not affect people equally. What is meant by that from your perspective, if you could elaborate on that?
Well, yes, traditionally marginalized populations such as those already in the informal sector, women, children, and young people, minorities, indigenous people, refugees, and internally displaced persons are disproportionately affected by the current lack of jobs offering decent work. And there are others such as workers with disabilities and older workers who are also vulnerable to exploitation and abuse.
And these are rather grim perspectives, Professor. Do you have any positive messages which you can share and any recommendations based on your assessment that you've made?
Yes, of course, it is important to acknowledge at the same time that the majority of member states have introduced or are introducing a number of economic and social protection measures to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, ranging from furlough or job retention schemes, tax credits, bank loans, and to extra social security benefits and free medical treatment and testing. And these good practices are encouraging, certainly, but their effectiveness and appropriateness must be carefully analyzed. So, for instance, it is not clear whether the extra funding actually reaches to the most vulnerable at this stage. A question also remains as to whether the existing support is accessible to everyone without discrimination on various grounds. I will therefore continue to monitor the situation and provide regular updates through my thematic and country mission reports for the foreseeable future. In this regard, I would like to seek your continuing assistance in forwarding me relevant information. I would also like to encourage member states to accept my country visit requests so that we can work together to address contemporary forms of slavery during the COVID-19 pandemic. On another note, I would like to commend the invaluable work of civil society organizations which have provided essential support to survivors of slavery and related practices, despite the resource limitation and other difficulties, constraints experienced as a result of the pandemic. Many civil society organizations were quick to find creative solutions to reach their beneficiaries despite the lockdowns. Many switched, for example, to online services and remote support, which may have been helpful for some victims and survivors. And yet, still others are struggling to cope with the challenges caused by the pandemic. In my report, I called for increased support and resources allocation to civil society organizations and first responders, including those employed in the government agencies. I also urged states to ensure legal survivors' access to justice and remedies, which include concrete legal, medical, and social assistance and protection measures tailored to the needs of survivors. I shall stop here for my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Obokata, for your assessment and for your presentation of the highlights of your report. And to all delegates, we have included a link to the Special Rapporteur's report in the chat areas. You can take a look at the full report there. We will now be exploring deeper some of the issues raised in the Special Rapporteur's report. In the next sessions, we'll have conversations with both members of civil society anti-slavery organizations, as well as representatives of states to get their perspectives about what they're facing in their countries relating to modern slavery, the challenges they face with the pandemic, how they have adapted, and what still needs to be done. So in our next session, our first guest joins me from an organization in India that provides support to survivors of trafficking. As many of you know, the provision of support to victims and survivors of modern slavery is really vital in the struggle against contemporary forms of slavery. However, even before we entered this new era of COVID-19, the provision of support to survivors was really lacking in national government response. For example, in the CHRI Walk Free report, we found that only 25% of countries in the Commonwealth have national referral mechanisms to coordinate victim assistance. And this also is a figure before COVID-19. We found that only 65% of Commonwealth countries reported gaps in funding for victim assistance programming. We know now that COVID-19 has exacerbated the vulnerabilities of victims and survivors of modern slavery. And so continued and in fact increased support for survivors is more imperative than ever. To speak about her experiences as a civil society leader, providing direct support to victims of modern slavery, our next guest is Smriti Sengupta. Smriti is a fellow of Ford and Columbia University and a member of the Global Women Leadership Network, Silicon Valley. She's a purpose-driven social entrepreneur from India, and she co-founded the organization Destiny Reflection, which is a Kolkata-based hybrid social enterprise that now works globally to disrupt the cycle of exploitation of women and children and to combat re-trafficking. We are also grateful to have Destiny Reflection as a member of the Commonwealth 8.7 network. So welcome, Smriti. To start, perhaps can you briefly share with us a little on the scope and focus of your organization?
Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be here and a part of this network 8.7.
Smriti, is there a way that we can increase your volume? I'm sorry, I can barely hear you.
I am at full volume. It's full here. Can you hear me? Is it better?
Not that much, no. Not for me anyway.
Hello, hello, is it now?
We can hear you, but it's very low.
Honestly, don't know.
Could you move closer to the microphone, perhaps?
Yeah, is it any better? Hello, hello.
No, it's not. It's still very, very distant from the microphone.
No, I'm very close to my PC, actually. Sound is okay.
The sound is okay with some of the panelists or some of the delegates? Okay, let's just go ahead then. Please continue. A little bit about your organization, Smriti.
Yeah, so Destiny Reflection is a 13-year-old anti-trafficking organization. Our mission is to disrupt the cycle of sexual exploitation and trafficking. Our beneficiaries are children and young adults who are at risk or who have suffered exploitation or have been trafficked, either within India or from neighboring countries. and a little bit about our programs. So our programs and services are designed to firstly to identify and reach out to the victims and at-risk ones as well, and to help them become resilient, so to avoid further exploitation. And a little bit more about the program. So we operate in the government, work in the government children's shelter home, where we cater to children who were rescued from brothel, domestic abuse, cross-border trafficking, nets, and factories also. And then we run a short stay home for, 18 plus girls who are in transit from shelter home. And the next program is we run in a red light area to avoid intergenerational servitude. And the last but the not least is the social enterprise we run, which is the first one in Kolkata, training and employing victims of sex trafficking.
And thanks for that, Smritha. It's very interesting what your organization does. How has your organization been impacted by COVID-19?
Yeah, so it is, I think first line which comes to me is like mounted work pressure, or work pressure, it's too much. So we had to very quickly shift and adjust to our operations in order to respond to the COVID crisis. So it is from distributing food and basic items to emotional, psychological support, financial support, and the most important part was a constant vigilance to our beneficiaries to ensure they are secured and, well-being. And also communication at all levels, like government, NGOs, funders, buyers, and our extended network. So, and just to add a little bit more, we started receiving frantic phone calls within 12 days of lockdown. And then we had to get into supplying food packets, etc. And also at the same time, we started fundraising, organized webinars, so to collect funds, accumulate funds. And our social enterprise also, is still struggling because we had to continue to pay salaries to our workers, and at the same time there are no sales. Mm-hmm. And also I can tell more. I don't know how much time you have about the survivors if you're interested to know.
Yeah, no, please go on. Please go on.
Yeah, so it was about the organizational, impact, how we reacted and how we responded to the crisis. And for the survivors, it was extremely hard, and I would explain a few levels. First one was the survivors who we already reintegrated. They reached out to us. Because one of the girls, for example, she became rent defaulter, and then she experienced extreme violence from her landlord, and she was abandoned she became homeless with her child because of this situation. And the second one I would mention are the survivors who were on the path of recovery, who still not reintegrated, but who they are in our homestay. We are keeping them on the homestay. So they are struggling because they don't have jobs, they lost their jobs, and they are, immense financial crisis and mental agony. And the risk factor has increased because they are taking, they're ready to take desperate decisions like moving cities or taking risky jobs, etc. And the red light area is also, the women's are also very challenged because social distancing was impossible there, and they are daily workers, and their income stopped completely. And many of them have been trafficked from different countries, so they don't even have identification card to access rations and foods. So it was difficult for them.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing those stories with us, Smritha. I know it's been a challenging time for both your organization, but in particular the impact of the pandemic on the people that you work with, the survivors and the victims of trafficking. Maybe can you tell us how the government authorities, what they have been doing? Have they provided any support to your organization or to other organizations that you know of who are working on the front lines?
No, government had, they are giving rations, rice, grain, pulses to everyone. But before they jumped in, we NGOs had to jump in and provide those food and ration items to them. So it has been extremely difficult to communicate with the government for us. And it wasn't very easy because they are busy with, in general, to tackle the pandemic situation. And I don't think the victims of slavery or at risk took the, what do you call it, like special place. It wasn't a priority.
Mm.
But we did announce some schemes, and I think which would be helpful in future.
Mm-hmm. And just for the future, looking ahead, what else do you think is needed now? And how can the government or the international community help?
Yeah, I think the number one would be, I would say the government should, urgently act and safeguard the children, because especially in the rural areas, because of the economic hardship, they are, the parents are giving away children to factories and anywhere for work or being trafficked. And that's happening a lot through online social media channels. So I think that is one of the most important parts government should take care of. And secondly, I think we need a multi-sector engagement to brainstorm on the economic crisis, what's going on at the moment. And also government, I think, should work more closely with NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Smriti, for sharing with us how the COVID-19 pandemic has created new challenges for your organization. But I think you've also outlined some quite important and relevant ways to address the challenges. For example, collaboration among CSOs, civil society organizations, multi-sector engagement. You mentioned the need for greater dialogue between governments, between the public and private actors and NGOs, but also importantly, the need for resources and capacity building to strengthen NGOs' ability to effectively navigate this new online space where we all find ourselves. You also highlighted the potential role of the private sector, and we have another guest a little later with whom we will explore that area further. So thank you. Thank you very much, Smriti, for your time. Appreciate it. Our next guest will provide us with a slightly different perspective. We will hear what some states have been doing to combat contemporary forms of slavery and how they have been tackling the additional challenges posed by COVID-19. Our next guest is Rita French. She's the Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations in Geneva and the International Ambassador for Human Rights. Rita's appointment was announced last year in May 2019, and the post is a first for the UK. So welcome, Rita.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Ambassador. So my first question to you is, what is your assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on the fight against modern slavery?
Now, before I begin, just want to thank the co-sponsors for today's event and for inviting me to take part. And just listening to Smriti right now speak about her work and her valuable work in India just reminded me of my recent visit to Nepal in January this year. Part of my role as a UK Human Rights Ambassador is to see some of the human rights projects which UK is supporting around the world. And I saw a very similar program being run in Nepal by a very fantastic, strong woman who is helping survivors of trafficking and to kind of create a new livelihood for them. So I think kind of the work that Smriti and others do around this area is very, very important. And as you say, kind of, the COVID challenge has kind of exacerbated that. And as other speakers have also elaborated, kind of, what we continue to sort of see is ongoing challenges around trying to make sure that they are not disproportionately impacted through this. I guess the other thing I really want to say, and again, echoing kind of what colleagues have also said, is that, as we embark on the final decade of inaction as such of SDGs, it's really kind of making sure that it counts, the final decade to get to the SDGs, to ensure that we can kind of deliver in that space. And I guess one of the things, again, which has been echoed elsewhere is that the lack of access to safe and reliable employment and a lack of social protection is completely aggravating these issues alongside, of course, increased health risks that vulnerable groups already face in their space, and which of course heightens their risk of exploitation. We know that the global economies contracted as a result of COVID-19 and the supply chains have been disrupted, and we know that these communities have been even more exposed, and as was reflected in earlier presentations, this has been felt by those working in those supply chains, particularly at a lower level, and I'm pleased that the UK has been making some progress in this space. The other thing I just want to highlight, of course, is I also recognise the impact that it's had on vulnerable children who've been exposed greatly so, and it's worrying concerns that the ILO talks about after the progress over the last 20 years, what we're now looking at is child labour figures globally may be increasing in terms of child trafficking and modern slavery in relation to children. So I guess kind of a plea there in that space will be as we head into 2021 and the UN Year of Elimination of Child Labour, that we mustn't lose sight of the progress we've made, but nor must we be kind of, ignorant of the challenge that remains going ahead.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, I would agree with you completely. Ambassador, you highlighted some of the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic has put on the area of modern slavery. What action is the UK taking at the international level in response to these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the UK has been very vocal on the international scene. You will recall that our former Prime Minister Theresa May was particularly championing this across the multilateral system. And the UK continues to work with partners both to assess the impact that COVID-19 is having on the most at risk of modern slavery and human trafficking, but also how we can provide immediate and long-term support. That includes engaging with the relevant UN agencies, the donors, civil society, and of course, strengthening the international response. And the multilateral system is essential for coordinating those efforts. And as mentioned, I sit here in Geneva, home of the Human Rights Council, and we are regularly engaging in the dialogue and in statements and in resolutions to ensure that this can be taken forward. And of course, we continue to support the international alliances such as Alliance 8.7 and Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, to share best practice with the international community and support the implementation. And it's vital, I guess, that all governments continue to champion the work of these essential bodies so that the international community can coordinate its efforts. And I think that coordination is really important. Of course, national action must be taken, but the international community must coordinate to eradicate modern slavery and deliver on the commitments that we've all signed up to. I guess the impact of COVID-19 only seeks to highlight the urgency of these efforts in this space. And I guess finally, just to say the call to action to end forced labour, modern slavery and human trafficking, which was launched at the UN General Assembly in 2017, is really now has over 90 endorsements. And again, I think we must make sure we turn those commitments, those words, those sign-ups really into action. And I think that's what the international community must do. We must of course, talk about it, but I think it's really important we continue to sort of support those programs on the ground and to look to reform those legislations that sort of endeavours to deliver those protections that are much needed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ambassador. One of the things that we here in the UK, and indeed organisations in the non-profit charity sector globally, is looking to with a bit of trepidation is the merger of the former Department for International Development and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And so if you could perhaps elaborate, well, will UK international programs to combat modern slavery continue following this merger?
Well, a short one-word answer is, of course, absolutely. I'm very excited that the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office now operates, and I think it's really important that we are able to join up all the efforts. And what I think of my role, particularly around the diplomatic effort through the Human Rights Council and multilaterally, but also with our development programs to ensure that we really do kind of help eradicate modern slavery going forward. And just to really say, kind of the UK's international efforts to fight slavery are supported by an ODA commitment of over £200 million, and the vast majority of money, although previously channeled through the Department for International Development, will continue to be channeled through the new department, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And some of the, I guess probably while I've got the floor, just to highlight some of the programs that the UK is investing on, and this is just kind of, I guess, a teaser, because in some respects, that we are working and operating across the Commonwealth in a number of different areas. So we've supported the training of 1,900 police officers in India. We've helped improve official responses to trafficking victims in Indonesia, in Ethiopia, in Mali. Of course, mentioned my visit to Nepal, and I know we're investing in other parts of Asia as well. And we've provided protection for more than 400,000 boys and girls at the risk of slavery in the Horn of Africa and along the migratory routes in Somalia, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So we really are trying to make sure that we can kind of channel those fundings to really kind of help and support the programs that Marita was talking about earlier, to make sure that those vulnerable in society are protected and continue to be protected going forward.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that. It's good to hear. And what about within the UK? Perhaps if you could briefly share with us what measures have been taken since the outbreak of COVID-19 to ensure that we are combating slavery at the domestic level.
Sure, and the UK is very open and honest about and recognising that modern slavery isn't just an issue that affects certain parts of the world or particular communities. And we're very clear that modern slavery is something that's happening in the UK and in the Western world. And in fact, we estimate there are between 10 to 13,000 victims in the UK, coming from over 130 countries. And again, as previously mentioned, one of the things we've taken forward is developing the first modern slavery strategy and a landmark Modern Slavery Act in 2015 that was driven by the former Prime Minister. And the UK's approach really draws on expertise across the spectrum. And what we now have got is an implementation task force, which brings together those within government and outside government to help effectively coordinate policy and deliver the operational response. We've also appointed an independent anti-slavery commissioner, now held by Dame Sarah Thornton, and established a drive toward implementation of the Act and hold the government to account. So I think it's really important that we recognise that, as well as just passing the necessary legislation, it's really important that the programme is being delivered, the objectives are being delivered, and the government itself is being held to account with respect to delivery of those. And specifically in relation to recent measures, and of course in COVID, I think one of our key areas, and again this was something that was mentioned earlier by other panellists, is around focusing on combating modern slavery in the supply chain network. And in March 2020, we became the first country to publish a government modern slavery statement, setting out steps that are taken to identify and prevent modern slavery in our supply chains. And we're expecting individual government departments to do the same over the course of next year as well. And in fact, just earlier this week, on the 22nd of September, the UK announced new measures to strengthen the Modern Slavery Act and ensure that large businesses and public bodies tackle modern slavery risks in supply chains. And essentially any public body with a budget of £36 million or more is required to report regularly on the steps they've taken to prevent modern slavery in their supply chains. So I think, this is another world first, but I think, these steps will enable us to really try and tone down domestically in terms of some of the challenges we face. But, just to be honest and clear, like everyone, we're facing an increasing challenge as a result of COVID, and there are many aspects of COVID-19 that continue to disproportionate impact on those vulnerable in society. And as I said, also true in the UK. So it'll be crucial that we learn from each other and forums like this and collaborate even more effectively if we are to succeed in eradicating slavery, by our ambition by 2030. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing your ideas with us and also the plans for UK for the future. We will be very much relying on the UK and its support to push the eradication of modern slavery onto the agenda of the CHOGM in June of next year. And we appreciate your time, the time that you've taken to join us, and also look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneh.
With our next guest, we return to the civil society perspective, exploring the impact of COVID-19 on business and supply chains in the context of contemporary forms of slavery. A significant gap in responses to modern slavery relates to taking responsibility for forced labor in global supply chains, and this was presented by Catherine earlier on in the session. And I can share some not very promising Commonwealth statistics from the CHRI Walk Free report. Only 4 Commonwealth countries require businesses to report on modern slavery risks, No Commonwealth countries have yet enacted legislation which requires businesses to undertake mandatory due diligence to assess modern slavery risks in their supply chains. The majority of action taken to combat forced labor in supply chains is currently through voluntary initiatives. And while such initiatives have been successful in improving protections against exploitation in specific regions or sectors where commitments do exist, on the whole, they do fall short of adequately addressing the problem. So here to speak about her work on monitoring human rights in global supply chains is Vera Belazelkowska from Canada. Vera is the Director of Programs at Alula in Canada, where she leads the design and implementation of programs to monitor human rights impacts in global supply chains, together with partners from the public, private, and civil society sectors. And Vera, I should also mention, is the Vice Chair of the Management Committee of the Commonwealth 8.7 Network as well. Welcome, Vera.
Thank you. Thank you, Sneh.
To start, perhaps, please, if you could tell us a little bit about your organization, and also if you could share how COVID-19 has had an impact on your work.
Yes, definitely. So a brief introduction of what we do at Alula. So we're a social innovation entity looking at how we can better leverage digital tools to amplify worker and community voices so that we can ensure better monitoring and mitigation of human rights risks in global supply chains. We always think about entry points for accessibility and anonymity when it comes to survivor, worker, and community feedback when it comes to monitoring business operations worldwide. And that includes anonymized and accessible grievance lines, worker surveys, and other types of content for awareness raising to really help organizations with better data so they can make decisions on responsible sourcing, ensure human rights due diligence and social compliance, as well as lead improvement initiatives together with their supplier base. Supply chains are extremely complex and opaque, and it really does take a multi-stakeholder approach to do this kind of work. And it has to be evidence-driven, and survivor and worker and community voices are extremely important in that process. And we work with governments, civil society groups, NGOs, and corporate partners to make sure that, that this type of activity is definitely a multi-stakeholder in nature. We've worked in over 30 countries now and across different value chains, including mining and manufacturing, as well as agriculture. And COVID-19 has certainly had impacts because we focus on digital engagement. All of us are clearly having these conversations not in person and on digital platforms. So we've been busy at work thinking around how we can ensure that our digital tools are available to as many workers and community members around the globe during this time, especially because we've been all quick to modify and adapt to a new digital way of engaging with each other, and we cannot drop the ball when it comes to consultation with these key stakeholders and rights holders. All organizations have been required to adopt a lot of agility in pivoting and responding to this rapidly changing context. On our team, what that's meant is building new methodologies and surveys to support some of our partners in remotely capturing these risks related to COVID. And of course, we can't stop consulting with key stakeholders just because we're not able to be there in person anymore. So it's been really important to shift because now I think it's especially even more important as the report that was presented. Of course, it showcases that there is even greater vulnerabilities because of this crisis. The Business Human Rights Resource Center, they recently were tracking the public allegations by migrant workers in the Gulf. And since the pandemic started, amongst workers in the domestic sector, the construction sector, there was a 275% increase in labor abuse allegations in the Gulf by migrant workers. And 95% of those allegations, they were related to impacts connected to COVID-19. So it's really important that we now more than ever listen to the rights holders and try to incorporate their feedback in decision making.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that, Vera. It's very interesting. Just a reminder before I ask you the next question, just a reminder to all attendees and delegates to, if you do have questions for any of the speakers, please do indicate so in the chat box or on the Q&A box, which you can access at the bottom of your screen, and we'll discuss those questions in the open discussion just after the session. So again, thanks for that, Vera. Just a question a follow-up question. As a result of COVID-19, have you noted any additional pressures on supply chains and on workers? And if so, how have these been manifested? Who is mainly affected?
Yes, it's a great question. We've obviously seen a massive cancellation of orders in business and supply chains. So if you can imagine, a company like H&M, their revenue dropped by 50%. So that kind of impact ripples through the supply chain in textile and garment. So we've noticed a lot of canceled orders, a lot of unpaid orders. We've spoken to factory managers in Bangladesh and India that say that they have orders that have been shipped from February that have not been paid, but the pressure to pay their workers is obviously there. So there's been a lot of pressure on the supply chain just from the inability for orders to ship or for companies to keep their commitments. And always workers end up carrying the biggest brunt of the damage. Recently we did a project with a sustainability initiative based in Europe in the textile and garment sector, and we gathered the feedback remotely of 20,000 workers in the sector. And we identified some massive issues related to unpaid sick leave and gaps in health benefits and a lot of job loss and termination. So of course, it's really important for businesses to think about the kind of impact they're having when it comes to canceling or not being able to meet commitments to their supplier partners. And also this pandemic will end at some point. And these relationships between businesses and suppliers, they have to remain healthy and respectful and accountable, because then it's going to be very hard for businesses and brands to find suppliers if they haven't met their commitments during this difficult time and they've put them in difficult positions. We of course know that there's, as the report and many other research efforts have shown, that 164 million migrants around the world are one of the most vulnerable, especially in this time. This has meant a lot of repatriation of migrant workers, and oftentimes they can be repatriated back to their home countries without receiving wages, dues, or benefits, which will perpetuate that vicious cycle of debt and poverty, especially for workers who pay money to labor agents and recruiters to get those jobs abroad. For the other half of the workers who are not repatriated, they're actually stuck abroad. So they're not able to go back home, they're not able to travel, and oftentimes their visas are connected to employers that no longer can employ them. So they are almost forced to go into the informal economy, and that increases further their risk to contemporary form of slavery. And finally, we've even seen some risks related to incarcerated labor. So in Malaysia, for example, an industry board recently started to lobby for the idea of hiring incarcerated labor on palm oil plantations because of the inability to meet labor demand because of travel restrictions. Of course, the idea is there's already risk issues in the palm oil sector across Southeast Asia and beyond, and this is a sector already plagued with challenges. So, of course, we might see even more heightened labor rights risks with new stakeholder groups, like, for example, incarcerated labor, when it comes to business and human rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Vera. That's a very bleak picture you're painting, but I agree that those that are the most vulnerable are hit the hardest. Maybe we can talk about how COVID-19 has highlighted or amplified some of the systemic issues related to contemporary forms of slavery.
Yes, it's really, I think that the pandemic leading to massive job loss has been quite shocking, but it is also highlighting some really deep-seated inequalities. So it's putting the spotlight with over 40 million jobs lost around the world. It's we are still seeing some of the most profitable companies in the world walking away with massive revenue and profits. The recent Oxfam report found that 32 of the world's most profitable companies are expected to make 109 billion more in 2020 than in previous years. So that really does put into question the idea of equity and distribution and who this economy, this global economy, is working for. And, you know, in our study that we did in the garment textile sector that I mentioned, we didn't just unearth issues of unpaid sick leave, but we also found systemic problems like the absence of grievance mechanisms, which didn't start with COVID-19, as well as absence of contracts. 1 in 5 workers reported that they do not have access to a contract in their language that they can understand. So how are they supposed to advocate for their rights if they don't really have a contract as leverage? So that these issues are systemic, they haven't started now. We're seeing some, you know, not to only paint a bleak picture, we're seeing some movements, and maybe because we're having a spotlight on these issues, not just the current health and safety, but also the systemic challenges. We're seeing some movements by governments and companies that are going in the positive direction. For example, Qatar just announced a new labor reform, including a minimum wage increase, which hopefully will show progress towards a decent work agenda. But also, for example, the introduction of a wage protection system in the country. And even though this effort of banning the kafala system, which is tying migrant workers to specific employers on their visa, although that advocacy to ban it didn't start with COVID, it just so happened that it was potentially the last straw. And it did push the government to finally ban the system, which was really increasing the vulnerability and the potential risk of contemporary forms of slavery amongst migrant workers. So we still have the challenge of enforcement. Now, how can we monitor enforcement, especially when we're in these times where monitoring anything is very challenging? But at least we're seeing some kinds of shifts in regions and supply chains that are known to be high risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks, Vera. And finally, Vera, just very briefly, because we would like to turn it over to the Q&A. There's a number of questions, good questions from the delegates that we'd like to get to. Could you share with us about, share your thoughts about what's needed? What can government, what can business, what can the international community do to address these issues? Yeah,
great question. I think it's very important to start with the mindset shift. I think, especially with corporations, there needs to be a shift towards putting as great of an importance on monitoring and mitigating environmental, social, and governance risks as we have a pressure and advancement in efforts and robustness of processes related to monitoring data privacy or financial risk. It's really something that companies from the C-suite level have to embed into their strategy and operations. And I think also it's a mindset shift from compliance to impact. So instead of just checking a box, thinking about liability, and monitoring human rights due diligence just for the sake of liability, to really think about collaborative improvement and how can organizations, governments, CSOs, and companies work together in multi-stakeholder initiatives to end these violations. And we are seeing a convergence between regulation and other drivers such as investor pressure, consumer demand, to hopefully create this concoction of a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom, which is what has underlined a lot of the global sourcing around the world for the last many years.
Yeah, no, thank you, Vera, for your contribution. It's quite relevant. You've highlighted the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has increased vulnerabilities to labor rights abuses in global supply chains, especially amongst migrant workers. And thanks also for sharing your ideas on the way forward. I think I agree with you. Corporate mindset does need to shift if this sector is to take these issues seriously, and for them to take action to support their verbal commitments. Brands and corporations have an important role to play to ensure strong and accountable relationships with producers across the globe to help protect workers from labor rights abuses. So thank you very much, Vera, for your contribution here and also for your continuing work with the Commonwealth 8.7 network of civil society organizations.
Thanks.
We will now turn to the open discussion, the Q&A session. We've received a number of questions from some of you, and we invite you again to post your questions in the Q&A box. Please include your name and where you're writing from in the post if you have any further ones. We are, just as a reminder, we're live streaming this event on YouTube, which is also being moderated, and questions from YouTube viewers have also been included in the Q&A box. We have about 8 to 10 minutes to hear from our expert speakers, their thoughts on the questions you have raised. I'll now turn to my colleague Sanjoy, and I hope the technical issues have been resolved. Sanjoy, he will moderate the Q&A session for us. Sanjoy? Sanjoy, are you there? Okay, I think he's dropped out, so I will take a look at the Q&A box. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So there's a number of questions. You can also upvote the questions that you would like responded in this session. The first question is from Madhurima Dhanuka from New Delhi. Her question is not particularly linked to COVID-19, but more generally, we find that sometimes victims of trafficking find their way to prisons, either charged for illegal entry into another country or sometimes as offenders, even though they were victims. What are or should be the protections available to them or support offered to ensure that they are not confined in prisons? And Special Rapporteur Tumoya Abokata, could you answer that question, please?
Of course, this is a very important question, and I think nowadays a number of countries, including the UK, have taken this non-punishment or non-criminalization principle, where these victims of trafficking and contemporary forms of slavery would not be imprisoned or punished. Let's say if they are, for example, being forcibly trafficked or being forced to work in a criminal activity and engage in criminal activities, and I think that should be the norm, and that is a principle that we want to promote to the rest of the world, I think. And certainly the protection, yes, they should not be imprisoned or held in detention. They should be provided protection instead. And you know, that's my view, and that's a view of the Special Rapporteur on trafficking, Shibon Mulali, who also have just recently been appointed to her post, and it is our job to make sure that principle is being applied to all member states, and that's what we will be doing during our time to promote that by working also with the civil society sector and so on.
Okay, thank you, Special Rapporteur. I'd like to, before I get on to the next question, I'd like to turn the floor over to Claudia Jerez, who's the Secretary of the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. She will talk about some of the impact of COVID-19 on the Voluntary Trust Fund. Claudia, are you there, please?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I appreciate it. Thank you, yes, to the organizers, to CHRI, and also to the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Obokata and his staff, for inviting us. Just very quickly, because I know time is running, to introduce briefly the fund, for those of you that don't know us. The UN Voluntary Trust Fund on Contemporary Forms of Slavery was created 3 decades ago by the General Assembly to fill gaps in support to victims. So we are here to provide assistance through grants to civil society organizations on the first milestone that one of the panelists spoke about, support to survivors. So through the fund this year, just to give you a taste, the fund is providing 37 grants in 33 countries to provide assistance to 15,000 survivors of slavery. So this can take the form of psychosocial care, medical treatment, educational support, legal representation, etc. Now, what we've seen with the pandemic is that there has been a sharp increase in demands for humanitarian support, such as food, safe shelter, hygiene kits, etc., as the panelists have illustrated. And the other thing is we have also seen an increase in demand for psychological support to deal with the mental impact of what is happening. So we are part, as I mentioned, we're part of the UN Human Rights Office, and we're one of several UN mechanisms. We have heard from the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. We also work hand in hand with the Special Rapporteur against Trafficking and the Special Rapporteur on Sale of Children against, and we work hand in hand and complement the work of the special rapporteurs, which, as you know, is more of a monitoring function, and we're more of the operational arm, if you will, to provide this direct support. We're very happy to have established immediately a working relationship with Mr. Obokata, who has already held a meeting with our Board of Trustees. And so we have kicked off, and actually 7 of our organizations that we're funding provided inputs to his report. So I don't think there's much time. We did a survey in May, and to hear from the organizations we're funding and their beneficiaries the impact, and it basically corroborates, what has already been said. So I won't go into much detail, but I would like to emphasize how organizations, these civil society organizations that are filling this gap, were able, as Ms. Sengupta said, to jump in, to respond, jump in quickly and devise new strategies, new programs. They shifted operations quickly in order to continue to operate and to meet these increased challenges and increased demands. So I could give examples, but I think time is running short. But to speak to the question that was asked earlier about the impact of these shrinking resources and increased demand on the international community and on the fund specifically, we are already feeling the brunt of this, unfortunately. We receive contributions from member states, and then these are redistributed to the civil society organizations through grants. So last year, we received 14 contributions from 14 member states, amounting to $870,000 US. So to round up, we can say approximately 900,000. This year, by way of comparison, we have only received 3 contributions, amounting to less than 100,000. We're very grateful for those contributions, and I'm happy to say that they're actually from 2 members of the Commonwealth, from India. I don't know if a representative is here today, and also from the United Kingdom. So our gratitude to them, to Ambassador French and others. So we very much appreciate the support, but it is not enough. We are quite worried that if we do not receive contributions by our November board session, we would have to cut funding to some of these organizations that we're funding. As I said, we're funding 37 this year, but actually we've received, we have an annual funding cycle, and so we actually have received 61 eligible project applications from organizations, and this amounts to 2 million. So here you will see we have 2 million in eligible requests, and we've received less than 100,000. So there's quite a big disparity. So I won't go on, but just really thank those who have contributed and encourage more, as a special rapporteur has done in his report and his appeal to the Human Rights Council. And again, thank you for allowing us to take the floor so that we can help survivors not only meet their basic needs, But again, as Ms. Sengupta, I would like to quote her intervention, I think speaks to a lot of what our organizations on the ground are facing. So trying to meet the basic needs in the first place, but especially to also build resilience so that the cycle can be broken. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. I think it's a really important intervention. The challenge is there. I know that the Voluntary Trust Fund helps a lot of very local community-based organizations who are working on the front lines to support survivors and eradicate contemporary forms of slavery. And it's a challenge when the funds are not able to do this. So thanks for your intervention. It does highlight a growing issue. I'm afraid that we've got some really interesting questions, particularly around survivor integration in decision-making processes and policy development. I'm afraid that we've got very little time, however. So we'll keep those questions and perhaps we can integrate that in some notes post workshop notes. They're very good questions. I really do thank you and appreciate all the attendees for thoughtfully contributing those questions to us. I'd like to actually now turn the floor, we've got about 2 minutes to close, I'm afraid. I'd like to turn the floor back to Sanjoy, who I hope is now with us. And just to say also that there's going to be an evaluation poll sent to you through this Zoom function. We have a quick evaluation poll in order to get your impressions of the side event. Please do take two seconds to fill this out because we'd like to know what you thought about this. Now back to Sanjoy for closing comments. Thank you.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me, and thank you, Sneh and panelists, for this excellent conversation, the experiences shared, and the points you've made, and for your enduring patience. I'm afraid I was off the call for a lot of the time because I had major challenges of connectivity, and then the power went. But I used 3 computers and my IT officers helped to get back. So Murphy's Law, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. But I want to thank you all for taking part in this side event, for those who asked questions, for the questions they asked, which were not perhaps answered because we ran out of time, to our moderator, for those who spoke, shared moving and powerful experience and always with great articulation. And it's the yawning gap between field and file, between practice and policy, that is really the challenge, that remains the challenge in this and many other fields. Leave no one behind is the call of the UN SDGs, which Ambassador Rita French referred to. And she talked about the trend, the standard that the UK has set with the first report on transparency in the business sector and supply chains. And I believe that although time is not on our side and the clock is ticking as it is in this session, one key benchmark must be CHOGM. And the report and the future CHOGMs which take place every 2 years. And our work is even more challenging because we are living at a time of manufactured news and manufactured consent. And the stories that you have shared need to be told more powerfully and more with greater dissemination over audio, visual, print, and offline. And this is even more critical because we see the harm and hurt that millions enslaved by generation of servitude, unjust laws, and unequal power asymmetries live with. The key is to hold, as you've said, governments, agencies, and mandate holders, especially human rights institutions, and upholders of the law, not just enforcers as police are seen in many countries, to account through robust engagement and pressure from our sides. It's unceasing and it's continuously challenging. And as we go home today, or remain home, as many of us are, we wish you safety and wellness in every way. Thank you and goodbye.
Just to say thank you for inviting me to this seminar. I thought it was a webinar. I thought it was very well run. So I look forward to working with you and participants and so on in the future. So please do keep in touch. And I do appreciate your work and so on. So I'll be following in the future, particularly on this topic of COVID-19. As I said, I promised to follow up. So I would appreciate you sending us information on a regular basis. So thanks once again.
Of course. Thank you for your participation and contribution. Appreciate it very much.